Beneath the cold waves of the North Sea lies a forgotten world, Doggerland, a vast stretch of land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. Around 10,000 years ago, after the last ice age, this fertile region was home to Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, forests, rivers, and thriving communities. But as glaciers melted and sea levels rose, Doggerland slowly drowned. A final blow came from a massive tsunami triggered by the Storegga landslide, wiping out what remained. Today, fishermen still haul up ancient bones, tools, and even mammoth remains from the seabed. Was Doggerland the real Atlantis of the North? Or just a reminder that nature always reclaims its own? Long before the familiar outlines of Europe emerged, before the chalk cliffs of Dover faced across the sea toward France, before the rolling tides of the North Sea carved their restless paths, there existed a land now forgotten. Today it lies hidden beneath cold, gray waters, its memory erased by the passage of millennia. Yet once it stretched wide, a vast plain of rivers, forests, and marshes linking Britain to continental Europe. This was Doggerland, a realm that flourished after the last ice age, inhabited by humans, animals, and cultures that thrived in a world where sea and sky were different than we know today. To imagine Doggerland is to strip away the waters of the North Sea and reveal a landscape alive with possibility. Around 12,000 years ago, as the Pleistocene glaciers retreated, enormous sheets of ice melted into rivers that carved channels across northern Europe. Britain was not yet an island. Instead, it was bound to France, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia by a fertile plain that sprawled hundreds of miles across. Mammoths, reindeer, and wild horses roamed its grasslands. Red deer stalked its woodlands, and human hunters followed herds across its open expanse. Rivers meandered through valleys, emptying into lakes and lagoons, while marshes teemed with waterfowl. In many ways, Doggerland was Europe's heartland, a crossroads where migrating peoples met and mingled. The people of Doggerland were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, descendants of groups who had survived the harshest glacial climates and now flourished in a warming world. They built temporary camps along riverbanks, fashioned tools from flint and bone, and painted stories into the very fabric of their tools and ornaments. Archaeological evidence, tools dredged from the seabed, fragments of wood and bone caught in fishing nets, speaks of a culture both resourceful and adaptive. They crafted harpoons for fishing, axes for clearing woodland, and ornaments that hinted at a symbolic life as well as a practical one. Though their names and languages are lost, their presence lingers in the artifacts that surface from the sea's floor like whispers of a forgotten song. Geologically, Doggerland was the product of a transitional age. As the Ice Age waned, global sea levels were still lower than today, but rising steadily as glaciers melted. Around 10,000 years ago, Doggerland was a lush, habitable region, its soils fertile, its rivers abundant with fish, its marshes rich with reeds and birds. Archaeologists believe it may have supported thousands of people, perhaps more than lived in Britain itself at that time. To these communities, the land must have seemed timeless, eternal. Yet even as they thrived, the waters crept closer. The rising seas were relentless. Driven by global warming at the close of the Ice Age, ocean levels rose meter by meter over centuries, slowly swallowing low-lying plains. Coastal camps were abandoned, rivers cut new channels, marshes expanded. People adapted, moving to higher ground, building rafts or simple boats, adjusting their hunting grounds. But the process was inexorable. What seemed gradual in human time was unstoppable in geological time. Doggerland, though still vast, was shrinking. The land's fate was sealed not only by rising seas, but by cataclysm. Around 8,200 years ago, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, the Storegga slide, triggered tsunamis that swept across the North Atlantic. Waves crashed into Doggerland's plains, inundating its lowlands, drowning forests, and scattering communities. Archaeologists suggest that in a single event, much of Doggerland's remaining territory was devastated. Combined with continued sea level rise, this catastrophe hastened its disappearance. Within centuries, what had once been a continental heartland was reduced to an island, and then to shoals and sandbanks. By around 6000 BCE, Britain was isolated, an island severed from Europe by the waters of the North Sea. Yet Doggerland was not forgotten immediately. Oral traditions may have carried memories of a land lost to the sea. Later myths of drowned kingdoms, of lands swallowed by waves, may echo faintly the trauma of its disappearance. Archaeologists point to stories like the Welsh Cantor Gwaelod or the Breton tales of Y.S., legends of fertile lands submerged by oceans, as possible cultural memories of Doggerland's fate. While such connections cannot be proved, they remind us that human beings do not easily forget catastrophes, and memory often transforms into myth. The modern discovery of Doggerland is itself a story of chance. For centuries, fishermen working the North Sea dredged up strange finds: antlers, bones of mammoth and woolly rhinoceros, flint tools far older than their nets. At first, these were curiosities, misunderstood remnants of some ancient past. But as geological and archaeological science advanced, a picture emerged. These bones and tools came not from scattered deposits, but from a vast drowned landscape. Sonar mapping of the seabed revealed ancient river channels, submerged hills, and lakebeds, features of a vanished world preserved beneath the waves. Doggerland was no legend but a real, thriving land, erased only in human sight, not in geological memory. To modern imagination, Doggerland is more than prehistory. It is a symbol of fragility, a reminder that landscapes we consider permanent are in fact fleeting. For the people who live there, the rising seas must have seemed an incomprehensible betrayal. The land that had nurtured them disappearing beneath waves, their homes drowned, their hunting grounds erased. In their story lies a parallel to our own age, when rising seas again threaten coastlines and displace millions. Doggerland whispers a warning across millennia. The sea gives, and the sea takes away. And yet, Doggerland is also a story of resilience. Its people did not vanish, but migrated, adapting to new coasts, new islands, new ways of life. The Mesolithic cultures that thrived after Doggerland's loss were shaped by that experience of change. They became expert seafarers, navigators of channels and islands, bearers of memory and adaptation. In their survival, Doggerland lives on. Thus, the first chapter of Doggerland's saga introduces not just a lost land, but a living reminder that beneath the gray waters of the North Sea lies a buried world, once green and thriving, once central to Europe's story. It was a land that shaped lives, fostered cultures, and then was erased by forces beyond human control. The death of Doggerland was not sudden but inexorable, a slow drowning punctuated by catastrophe, leaving behind only bones, tools, and myths. Yet in its loss, it gave rise to new beginnings, as survivors carried forward their skills and memories into new landscapes. The ghost of Doggerland remains with us still, visible in sonar maps, in bones dredged from seabeds, in myths of drowned lands, and in the restless waves of the North Sea. It reminds us that the ground beneath our feet is never truly permanent, that history is written not only in stone but also in water, and that all lands, however vast, can be lost. To understand Doggerland, one must return to the twilight of the last ice age, a time when Europe's landscapes were shifting on scales both vast and intimate. 10,000 years before the present, the Earth was a place of transition. Glaciers that had stretched like frozen mountains across northern Europe were melting, their retreat carving valleys, flooding basins, and feeding rivers that braided across the lowlands. It was in this age of flux, of ice giving way to water, of tundra giving way to forest, that Doggerland emerged, a land born from both destruction and renewal. At the height of the Pleistocene glaciation, much of northern Europe was locked beneath ice sheets thousands of feet thick. The weight of these frozen masses pressed down the crust itself, depressing the land beneath Scandinavia and Britain. To the south lay tundra plains, swept by bitter winds, where mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, and reindeer roamed in search of the sparse vegetation. Britain, far from being an island, was a promontory of the continent, connected seamlessly to France, the Low Countries, and Germany. Sea levels were lower by over 100 meters, locking water into ice. The North Sea basin lay dry, its rivers winding through valleys that today lie drowned. When the climate warmed around 12,000 years ago, the glaciers retreated. As they melted, they unleashed torrents of water, carving new river systems and feeding immense lakes. The land, freed from the pressure of ice, began to rebound upward in a slow process known as isostatic rebound. Yet the sea rose faster than the land could recover. Each year, waters crept farther into the low-lying plains, swallowing valleys and creating wetlands. The basin of the North Sea transformed into a vast, fertile land, Doggerland, an expanse of meadows, marshes, and river valleys stretching from modern Britain to Denmark. The geology of Doggerland reveals a landscape rich and varied. Sonar mapping of the seabed shows ancient river channels winding toward what is now the English Channel. These rivers drained into vast estuaries and lagoons, feeding ecosystems of immense biodiversity. Hills, now submerged shoals, rose like islands above the plains. At the heart of this drowned world lies the Dogger Bank, a shallow rise in the central North Sea, once a rolling upland covered in grass and forest, now a fishing ground bearing the lost land's name. To the people who dwelled there, Doggerland was not marginal but central, a land of abundance, bridging coasts that today face each other across waters. The ecological transformation was breathtaking. As tundra receded, forests of birch and pine advanced, followed by oak, elm, and hazel. Rivers teemed with salmon and trout, marshes with geese and ducks. Herds of red deer, aurochs, and wild boar roamed freely. Wolves and bears prowled the forests, while foxes darted along riverbanks. The people of Doggerland hunted, fished, and gathered in this shifting mosaic, their lives bound to seasonal cycles. Archaeological finds, harpoons carved from antler, flint tools dredged from the seabed, testify to their skill and adaptation. Doggerland was no barren wasteland, but a thriving cradle for Mesolithic cultures. Yet the forces that had created Doggerland also conspired to erase it. As ice melted across the globe, sea levels rose inexorably. What had been dry valleys became estuaries. What had been meadows became tidal flats. People adapted, moving camps to higher ground, fashioning boats and rafts to navigate the expanding waters. For centuries they endured, adjusting to each encroachment. But the sea was patient and relentless. By 8,000 years ago, the low-lying plains were reduced to scattered uplands and islands. The final blow came with violence. Around 8,200 years ago, the Storegga Slide, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, triggered tsunamis across the North Atlantic. Walls of water swept into Doggerland, inundating its remaining settlements. Though the people of the time lacked written records, the trauma must have been immense. Villages drowned, forests flattened, rivers swallowed in hours. For survivors, the encroaching sea was no longer gradual but catastrophic, a force of annihilation. In combination with the steady rise of oceans, the tsunamis hastened Doggerland's disappearance. Within centuries, it was reduced to shoals, then to nothing but submerged sandbanks and memories. Geologists studying cores from the seabed trace this story in layers of sediment. Beneath the waters of the North Sea lie buried soils, pollen grains from vanished forests, and peat beds once part of marshes. These are the geological fingerprints of Doggerland, preserved beneath silt and sand. Each core is a time capsule. Traces of hazel pollen reveal when forests advanced. Grains of saltwater diatoms mark the moment sea overwhelmed land. Science resurrects what the sea buried. For modern humanity, Doggerland's geology offers more than curiosity. It is a warning. The slow drowning of this land mirrors the threats faced by our own coasts as seas rise again under climate change. For the Mesolithic people, the rising waters were inexplicable, forces of gods or fate. For us, the science is clear, yet the outcome may be similar. Doggerland reminds us that no landscape, however vast, is immune to the sea's hunger. But Doggerland is also a testament to resilience. Its people adapted for centuries, moving with the water, reshaping their lives around marsh and estuary, becoming skilled seafarers in a new, wetter world. The same ingenuity that led them to hunt mammoth on frozen plains now allowed them to navigate rivers and tidal currents. Their descendants carried forward not only tools and traditions, but also memories of a land lost. These memories may live still in myths of drowned kingdoms, whispers of a time when the sea claimed what once was home. The geological birth and death of Doggerland is thus both tragedy and transformation. It was created by ice and undone by water. It nurtured life for millennia, then was drowned in waves. But it left an enduring mark, not only in the bones and tools dredged from the seabed, but in the trajectory of European prehistory. The isolation of Britain, cut off by the sea, shaped the island's culture and history for thousands of years. Doggerland's drowning was not only geological but cultural, severing ties and forging new identities. Thus, Chapter 2 traces Doggerland's rise from icebound plain to fertile heartland and its fall into the sea. It reminds us that landscapes are not permanent but fluid, born of forces beyond human control. The land revealed by ice and fire was lost to water, but its story remains. Etched in sediments, preserved in myths, and whispered by the restless waves that cover it still. Though the waves of the North Sea now cover its plains, Doggerland was once alive with people whose lives were interwoven with its forests, rivers, and marshes. They were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, heirs of those who had endured the last ice age, and they made this fertile landscape their home. To imagine Doggerland is to conjure the smell of wood smoke rising from riverside camps, the calls of waterfowl across marshes, the glint of flint tools in the hands of hunters, the chatter of children at the edges of forests. It was not merely a land. It was a living world, and its people were its pulse. The Mesolithic era, spanning roughly 10,000 to 5,000 BCE in Europe, was a time of adaptation. Ice Age megafauna like mammoth and woolly rhinoceros were disappearing, while forests and wetlands expanded. In this shifting environment, the people of Doggerland thrived as foragers. They lived in small, mobile bands, perhaps a few dozen individuals each, moving seasonally to exploit resources. In summer, they might gather berries and nuts along river valleys. In winter, they hunted deer and boar in the shelter of woodlands. Archaeological evidence dredged from the seabed, microliths, harpoons, fishing gear, speaks of their ingenuity. Their homes were likely modest shelters of wood, bone, and hide. Post holes discovered at sites on Britain's once connected coast suggest circular huts, covered in skins or reeds. Fires burned at their centers, smoke drifting through holes in the roof. Around these hearths, families gathered to cook fish, roast venison, and tell stories. The rhythm of life was communal, survival dependent on cooperation. Women and children gathered roots, herbs, and shellfish. Men and women alike hunted and fished. Social roles were fluid, bound more by necessity than by rigid hierarchy. The rivers and wetlands of Doggerland offered extraordinary abundance. Salmon surged upstream in spring, and fish traps fashioned from woven reeds or wooden stakes likely captured them in great numbers. Harpoons carved from red deer antler, many recovered by fishermen from the North Sea, show the importance of fishing. Seals basked on sandbanks, waterfowl nested in marshes, and shellfish crowded tidal flats. The sea, rather than a barrier, was a larder, its resources woven into daily life. Hunting also remained central. Red deer, elk, and aurochs, wild cattle, roamed the plains, their migrations followed by human bands. Flint-tipped arrows and spears brought them down. Bones found in dredged deposits show evidence of butchering, their marrow extracted for sustenance. Dogs, domesticated from wolves, may have aided hunters, driving game toward traps. These companions, loyal and alert, were as much part of the community as any human, sharing fires and scraps in return for their service. The people of Doggerland also gathered plants in remarkable variety. Hazelnuts were a staple, roasted to preserve them through winter. Wild fruits, sloe, crabapple, bilberry, supplemented diets rich in protein. Medicinal herbs such as yarrow and meadowsweet may have been used for healing. Birch bark provided not only material for containers, but also tar for hafting tools. This deep knowledge of the land reflected generations of observation, a science passed orally through stories and practice. Their tools reveal sophistication. Microliths, tiny, sharp flint blades, were hafted into wooden shafts to create arrows or spears. Bone and antler were carved into harpoons and awls. Fishing nets of plant fibers, though rarely preserved, are inferred from weights and floats. Ornaments made from pierced animal teeth or shells hint at symbolic or decorative traditions, suggesting that Doggerland's people, like their descendants, found meaning beyond mere survival. They sang, they carved, they decorated, they remembered. What did they believe? No written words survive, but clues can be gleaned from later European traditions and the artifacts themselves. Burial practices, or known, suggest reverence for the dead. Some Mesolithic burials in Europe included grave goods, tools, ornaments, perhaps intended for use in another world. Carved figurines and decorated objects suggest symbolic or spiritual life. The rivers, forests, and animals of Doggerland were likely infused with meaning, their spirits invoked in ritual. The people lived not apart from nature but within it, their worldview animistic, seeing life in every tree, stone, and beast. Population density was low, but the land could have supported thousands. Groups met seasonally to exchange goods, partners, and stories. Flint from distant quarries, shells from coasts far away, testified to networks of exchange across wide distances. Doggerland was not an isolated wilderness, but a crossroads, where communities mingled, intermarried, and shared knowledge. Britain, later an island, was then seamlessly connected to continental Europe, and its people were part of a larger Mesolithic tapestry. The encroaching sea, though gradual, must have been noticed. Camps once on dry ground became marshy, forests drowned in salt water, their trunks standing like skeletons in brackish lagoons. Fishing grounds shifted as tides advanced. Communities adapted, moving inland, building boats of dugout logs to navigate waterways. Yet the memory of land lost may have haunted them. Stories of ancestors' camps swallowed by waves, of hunting grounds now unreachable, may have circulated as warnings and laments. In these narratives, perhaps, lie the distant origins of Europe's later myths of drowned kingdoms. Modern archaeology breathes life back into these people. In 1931, a trawler dredging the Dogger Bank hauled up a fragment of human skull, stained brown by centuries beneath the seabed. Later finds included tools, bones of red deer, aurochs, and even carvings. Each object is a voice across 10 millennia, telling us of lives lived in intimacy with a land now drowned. These fragments, though sparse, reveal continuity. The people of Doggerland were not strange or alien, but human as we are, sharing families, fears, hopes, and stories. The people of Doggerland were also innovators. As seas rose, they developed watercraft, likely dugout canoes, to traverse rivers and estuaries. The skill of fishing became as vital as hunting. This adaptation to changing environments foreshadowed the seafaring cultures that would dominate northern Europe in millennia to come. In their resilience lies a story of human ingenuity. Faced with change, they did not collapse, but transformed. Yet the ultimate fate of Doggerland's people was dispersal. As the land shrank, communities migrated to higher ground, into Britain, into continental Europe, carrying their skills and traditions. They blended with other groups, their unique identity submerged with their homeland. But they left echoes, tools, bones, myths that remind us they once thrived on land now hidden beneath waves. Thus, Chapter 3 restores the people of Doggerland to their rightful place in history. They were not faceless victims of rising seas, but communities who lived, loved, adapted, and endured. Their story is not merely of loss, but of resilience and memory. Doggerland was not just a land of rivers and forests. It was a human world, alive with laughter, toil, and song, until the sea reclaimed it. For centuries, the people of Doggerland had lived with the creeping sea. They adapted as forests drowned, as valleys turned to estuaries, as marshes spread where meadows once stretched. But their adjustments were shaped by time, by decades and generations. What they could not have prepared for was the sudden terror of a single day, when the sea did not advance patiently, but came as a roaring wall of water. Around 8,200 years ago, a catastrophe occurred in the North Atlantic, the Storegga Slide, that sent tsunamis racing into the North Sea. For Doggerland, already diminished by centuries of rising seas, it was a final blow. The Storegga Slide was one of the largest submarine landslides in history. Off the coast of Norway, vast amounts of sediment, perhaps thousands of cubic kilometers, suddenly collapsed, cascading down the continental slope into the abyss. The movement displaced enormous volumes of seawater, generating waves that radiated across the North Atlantic. In Norway, Scotland, and the Shetland Islands, geological deposits still record these events. Layers of sand washed far inland, carried by waves higher than houses. For Doggerland, lying in the path of these tsunamis, the devastation was unimaginable. Picture the scene. Families along Doggerland's rivers and lagoons going about their daily lives, fishing, roasting hazelnuts, repairing tools, when suddenly the sea pulled back. The shoreline, once familiar, retreated unnaturally, exposing mudflats and fish gasping in the sand. Then, with a roar, a wall of water surged forward. Waves perhaps 10 to 20 meters high crashed into the lowlands, sweeping away forests, camps, and people alike. Those in dugout canoes had no chance. Those on higher ground may have seen the devastation unfurl beneath them, helpless as entire valleys disappeared in moments. The tsunami struck repeatedly, not as a single wave, but as a series. Each surge tore deeper inland, carrying debris, animals, and humans. Fires were extinguished in an instant, hearths and shelters obliterated. Rivers changed course under the force, and saltwater poisoned freshwater pools. Archaeological evidence from Scotland and the Shetlands shows deposits of marine sand overlaying peat, a sign that the waves surged far beyond normal tide. Doggerland's plains, lower and flatter, would have suffered far worse. For survivors, the psychological trauma must have been profound. They had endured gradual change for generations, but nothing like this. In a single day, ancestral lands were erased. Burial grounds, sacred groves, hunting camps, all were drowned beneath a churning sea. Oral traditions may have preserved these memories. Later myths across Europe tell of lands lost suddenly to waves, of kingdoms swallowed in punishment or fate. While direct connection to Doggerland cannot be proven, the echoes are strong. Catastrophe births stories, and stories endure when the land does not. The Storegga tsunami did not erase all of Doggerland in a single strike, but it accelerated what was inevitable. Much of the low-lying territory was devastated, leaving only higher ground like the Dogger Bank above water. Communities that survived may have retreated to these shrinking uplands, clinging to what remained. But the blow was fatal. Rising seas continued their steady work in the centuries that followed, and Doggerland shrank from a plain to an island, from an island to scattered sandbanks, and finally to nothing but a memory beneath the sea. Geology preserves the traces of this apocalypse. In cores drilled from North Sea sediments, layers of sand deposited by the tsunami are visible, sandwiched between ancient peat. These layers testify to a single event of immense force, a marker of disaster written into the earth itself. Combined with evidence of rising seas, they confirm what oral memories and legends may have once carried. Doggerland died not only by drowning, but by violence. The human cost is harder to measure, but it must have been vast. Thousands may have died in the waves. Survivors were scattered, their communities broken, their homelands unrecognizable. Families who had lived for generations in fertile valleys were suddenly forced into exile. Some moved west into Britain, which was itself on the verge of isolation as seas rose. Others fled east into the Low Countries or Germany. Doggerland's people did not vanish, but their world did, and with it the coherence of a culture rooted in that land. The tsunami's timing coincided with broader climatic shifts. Around the same period, the so-called 8.2 kiloyear event brought a sudden cooling, likely caused by freshwater pulses disrupting ocean circulation. For Doggerland survivors, this meant not only flooded land, but harsher winters, shorter growing seasons, and more fragile ecosystems. Disaster piled upon disaster, driving migration and reshaping Mesolithic life across Europe. Yet, even in this destruction, resilience flickered. The people who had mastered fishing, hunting, and boat building carried those skills into new territories. Archaeological finds in Britain and continental Europe show continuity in tool styles and subsistence strategies, evidence that Doggerland's refugees adapted successfully. They became part of the larger story of Mesolithic Europe, their Doggerland heritage woven invisibly into cultures that endured long after their homeland disappeared. The memory of sudden flooding echoed through later European myths. In Welsh legend, the fertile land of Cantor Gwaelod was drowned by the sea when its defenses failed. In Brittany, the city of Ys was swallowed for its sins. In Ireland, stories tell of lands lost beneath the waves, and in the Low Countries, folklore recalls ancient floods. Whether these are distant echoes of Doggerland's end or independent tales, they share a resonance, that the sea can take as easily as it gives, that no kingdom is beyond its reach. To modernize, the Storega tsunami and Doggerland's drowning carry another message. We, too, live in an age of rising seas, of climate shifting beneath us. For the Mesolithic people, the forces were beyond comprehension, gods or fate. For us, the science is clear and the parallels sobering. Doggerland's fate foreshadows the fragility of our own coasts, the impermanence of what we think eternal. Thus, Chapter 5 tells of the final catastrophe that hastened Doggerland's end, a tsunami born of Earth's instability, sweeping away what centuries of rising seas had not yet claimed. It is the moment when slow drowning became sudden death, when a continent's heartland was transformed in hours into a graveyard. Doggerland's people endured, but their world did not. What remains is memory, etched in sediment, whispered in legend, and remembered whenever waves crash too far inland. The story of Doggerland is not only one of flourishing life, but of inexorable loss. It is the tale of a world slowly drowned, of rivers and forests claimed by waters that advanced not in a single catastrophic wave, but with patient, relentless persistence. To the Mesolithic peoples who called Doggerland home, the sea was both friend and enemy, provider of fish, shellfish, and transport, yet also thief of soil, hunter of forests, and destroyer of memory. Each generation inherited less land than the last, forced to adapt to a landscape shifting beneath their feet. Around 10,000 years ago, the great ice sheets that had covered northern Europe were gone, melted into torrents that swelled rivers and filled oceans. Global sea levels began to rise by meters over millennia. To the people of Doggerland, this rise may not have been perceptible in a single lifetime, but its consequences became undeniable. Campsites once dry became marshy, forest floors turned to bogs, and hunting grounds receded year by year. Communities that had flourished along river valleys found themselves moving inland or constructing canoes to reach fishing spots once walked to with ease. Geological evidence paints the picture. Cores taken from the North Sea's seabed reveal layers of ancient soils overlain by silt and sand, traces of once dry land drowned beneath tidal flats. Fossilized tree stumps, dredged by fishermen, tell of forests where oaks and hazels once grew tall before brackish water drowned their roots. Pollen grains preserved in peat beds speak of ecosystems gradually replaced, first fertile grasslands, then marshes, then estuaries. Doggerland's drowning is written not in chronicles, but in sediments, a silent archive of ecological transition. For the people, the change was more than environmental. It was cultural. Rising waters forced them into mobility, pushing camps to higher ground. Dugout canoes, carved from oak or pine, became more essential, enabling families to traverse rivers now broadened into estuaries. Fishing intensified, shifting from rivers to brackish lagoons and shallow seas. Shell middens, piles of discarded shells, along surviving coasts testify to communities leaning heavily on marine resources. In adapting, they preserved their survival, yet each adaptation was also a surrender, an acknowledgement that the sea was claiming land inch by inch. Myths may have begun here. Though we cannot recover Mesolithic stories, later European folklore is filled with tales of drowned lands. Cantor Gwaelod in Wales, Ys in Brittany, Lyonesse in Cornwall. Fertile kingdoms swallowed by waves. These echoes suggest a cultural memory of loss passed down through generations, reshaped into legend. Doggerland's drowning may have been the primal source, remembered dimly in fireside stories of ancestors whose homes were taken by the sea. For those who lived through it, the gradual encroachment must have been both bewildering and terrifying, a betrayal by the very earth beneath them. The loss was not uniform. Doggerland shrank unevenly, with higher ground surviving longer as islands amid encroaching waters. The Great Dogger Bank remained above sea level long after surrounding plains drowned, perhaps serving as a refuge for the last Doggerland communities. Here, families may have clung to the remnants of their world, fishing in expanding seas while watching the horizon creep closer each year. Eventually, even this last sanctuary succumbed, leaving only a shallow shoal beneath the waves. Archaeological finds bring poignancy to this story. A harpoon carved from red deer antler, dredged from the seabed, bears not only the mark of craftsmanship, but the shadow of disappearance, made by hands long gone, lost with the land they once walked. Human remains recovered from the North Sea, fragments of skull or bone, belong to people who lived on plains now vanished. Each artifact is a survivor, a relic of a world erased not by war or conquest, but by the slow violence of nature. The cultural trauma of Doggerland's drowning cannot be overstated. To lose land is to lose identity. Hunting grounds, sacred sites, burial places, all vanished beneath waters. Ancestors' bones, once honored, now lay in drowned soil. Communities who had lived for generations in familiar valleys were forced to abandon them, scattering into Britain, Scandinavia, and continental Europe. Their world contracted even as their seas expanded. For them, displacement was not a brief exile but a permanent uprooting, their homeland erased from the map. The culmination of this process came in catastrophe. Around 8,200 years ago, the Storegga slide off Norway sent tsunamis surging into the North Sea basin. Waves inundated the lowlands of Doggerland, flattening forests and drowning camps. Survivors would have seen walls of water rising over the horizon, sweeping away everything they knew. Though sea level rise had been gradual, this disaster must have been apocalyptic, compressing centuries of encroachment into hours of destruction. For some, it may have been the end of Doggerland as memory. From that moment, the land was no longer shrinking but gone. Yet the people did not vanish. They carried themselves into new lands, into Britain, now severed by channels of salt water, into the Low Countries in Germany, where forests and rivers still sustained them. Their knowledge of rivers, boats, and fishing became their inheritance, skills honed in Doggerland that would serve them in new geographies. In this way, Doggerland did not die entirely, but lived on through its people, transformed into migrants, seafarers, and survivors. For modern eyes, the drowning of Doggerland resonates as more than prehistory. It is a mirror of our own time. Rising seas once erased a continent's heartland, and rising seas may again erase coasts and cities in our own age. Doggerland's story warns that no land is eternal, that human cultures, however adaptive, are always at the mercy of earth and ocean. The people of Doggerland did not cause their world to drown, but they bore its cost. We, who do cause our seas to rise, must learn from their resilience and from their loss. Thus, Chapter 4 charts the slow unmaking of Doggerland, the rise of seas, the shrinking of land, the trauma of displacement. It is a story both geological and human, recorded in sediments and in legends, in harpoons dredged from seabeds and in myths of drowned kingdoms. Doggerland did not vanish in a day, but over centuries it slipped beneath waves, its people adapting, mourning, and moving. And in their story lies a timeless lesson: that all lands, however solid, are but temporary gifts of the earth. By the time the Storegga tsunami had surged across Doggerland's plains, much of the vast land that once linked Britain to continental Europe was already gone. Yet even after the waves receded, small fragments of Doggerland endured, clinging above the rising sea like memories refusing to fade. The largest of these was the Dogger Bank, a broad upland ridge that for centuries stood as the last refuge of the drowned world. Here, in the centuries after the Great Flood, the final islanders of Doggerland may have lived, fished, and remembered, surrounded on all sides by the sea that had consumed their homeland. The Dogger Bank today lies submerged beneath 15 to 30 meters of water, a sandbank stretching 260 kilometers across the North Sea. In Mesolithic times, it was not sand but soil, its higher ridges standing proud above the waves. Archaeological reconstructions suggest it may once have been a rolling hill country, dotted with lakes and forests, a miniature world where survivors retreated as the waters advanced. For centuries after much of Doggerland had drowned, the Dogger Bank remained, isolated yet habitable, a last stronghold of land in a sea of loss. Life on this shrinking island must have been precarious. The Dogger Bank offered game. Red deer, boar, and aurochs may have lingered there, along with flocks of birds nesting in its wetlands. Fishing would have been abundant, for the surrounding shallows teemed with cod, herring, and shellfish. Yet isolation weighed heavily. As the sea cut off connections to mainland Europe and Britain, the final communities of Doggerland may have found themselves increasingly dependent on boats for travel, trade, and survival. Canoes carved from logs would have been lifelines. Archaeological parallels from Britain and northern Europe show Mesolithic peoples were skilled boat builders, fashioning dugouts from oak or pine. These vessels would have carried Doggerland's last islanders across channels to trade with neighboring groups, exchanging flint, bone, and shell for resources unavailable on their shrinking island. The sea, once an encroaching enemy, became highway and barrier both, dictating every choice of survival. But the encroachment continued. Storm surges battered the Dogger Bank. Tidal currents eroded its shores. Slowly, what had been a broad upland plain fragmented into islets and shoals. Each generation inherited less land, fewer forests, narrower hunting grounds. The psychological weight of such loss is difficult to measure, but it must have been immense. For a people whose ancestors had lived on expansive plains, the confinement to shrinking islands was a constant reminder of mortality, not only of individuals, but of their world. Myths may have crystallized here. Imagine the stories told by firelight, of the great plain where ancestors hunted mammoth, of forests now lying beneath the waves, of spirits angry or sorrowful in the drowned lands below. Such myths may have traveled with survivors as they migrated into Britain and the continent, blending with other traditions and echoing faintly in later legends of drowned kingdoms like Lyonesse and YS. For the last islanders, memory and myth were all that remained of Doggerland's grandeur. Eventually, the Dogger Bank too succumbed. Rising seas continued their patient assault, and by around 6000 BCE, the last dry land vanished beneath the North Sea. Britain was now an island, its people cut off from continental Europe except by boat. The final chapter of Doggerland's story was complete. What had once been a continental heartland was erased, leaving only waves and sandbanks where rivers and forests had once flourished. The end of Doggerland reshaped Europe permanently. Britain's isolation fostered distinctive cultural developments, as its Mesolithic inhabitants adapted to insularity. Continental Europe, no longer connected by land, evolved separately. The very map of Europe as we know it, an island Britain facing a mainland across a narrow sea, was forged in Doggerland's drowning. Its loss was not only ecological and cultural, but geopolitical, a geological event with historical consequences echoing through millennia. Modern discoveries confirm this narrative. Fishermen dredging Dogger Bank have hauled up antler harpoons, flint tools, and bones of deer and aurochs. Each artifact is a voice from the last islanders, a fragment of life lived in the twilight of Doggerland. Sonar mapping reveals drowned river channels and lakes, preserved like ghostly veins beneath sand. In these traces, we glimpse the endurance of people who clung to the last edges of their homeland, refusing surrender until the sea erased the final ground beneath their feet. The fate of the last islanders also raises questions. Did they leave Dogger Bank voluntarily, migrating to Britain or the continent before the final submergence? Or were they trapped, watching the waters close in until no escape remained? Archaeology cannot yet answer. What is certain is that their legacy survived, not in the land itself, but in the descendants who carried their skills, stories, and resilience into new landscapes. Doggerland's people may have vanished, but their ingenuity lived on in those who fished the coasts of Britain, farmed the soils of Europe, and later built the cultures that defined prehistory. To us, the image of the last islanders is haunting. They stand as symbols of endurance in the face of inevitable loss, human beings confronting the limits of adaptation. Their story is both distant and familiar. For we, too, live in an age of rising seas. Coastal cities already face erosion and flooding, islands shrink in the Pacific, and millions are displaced by waters creeping higher each year. Doggerland's last islanders are our kin across millennia, their struggle echoing in our own. Thus, Chapter 6 tells of Doggerland's final refuge, the Dogger Bank, the last sanctuary of a drowned world. Here, the last islanders fished, hunted, and remembered, clinging to fragments of a once great land. Their endurance speaks to human resilience, their loss to human fragility, and their disappearance beneath the waves reminds us that all lands, however vast, are temporary, and that the sea waits patiently to reclaim what belongs to it. For thousands of years, Doggerland lay forgotten beneath the restless waters of the North Sea. Its rivers became channels of sand, its forests reduced to peat beds buried in silt, its hills masked as shoals and banks on nautical charts. To the sailors who plied these waters in later centuries, the sea offered no hint of the land that had once stretched from Britain to Europe. Doggerland had vanished, its people absorbed into the tides of prehistory, its memory buried. Yet the sea could not keep its secret forever. Piece by piece, clue by clue, the drowned land revealed itself to modern eyes, rising from obscurity into recognition as Europe's Atlantis. The first echoes came not from science, but from fishermen. For centuries, trawlers working the Dogger Bank hauled strange relics from the seabed. Bones of mammoth and woolly rhinoceros, antlers of giant elk, fragments of aurochs and red deer, flint tools chipped into blades, all surface tangled in nets. These were curiosities, sold to collectors or discarded as nuisances. Sailors told tales of giant bones dredged from the depths, yet few suspected they came not from scattered deposits, but from a drowned landscape. The North Sea, they assumed, had always been sea. The idea that it had once been land was inconceivable. It was only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that scholars began to piece together the evidence. As geology advanced, scientists recognized that sea levels had risen dramatically after the last ice age, flooding vast coastal plains. In 1913, a trawler dredged up a barbed antler harpoon from the Dogger Bank, unmistakably human-crafted. The artifact was Mesolithic, dating to a time when the sea was still land. Suddenly, the fishermen's tales of mammoth bones and flint tools took on new meaning. They were remnants not of isolated finds, but of an entire lost world. Throughout the 20th century, the evidence grew. More tools were recovered. Microliths, axes, harpoons. Animal bones bore cut marks, proof of human butchery. Fragments of human bone, including part of a skull dredged in 1931, confirmed that people had once lived where the North Sea now rolled. Yet it was not until the advent of modern technology, sonar mapping, seismic surveys, and sediment analysis, that Doggerland truly emerged from the waves. Oil exploration in the North Sea during the mid-20th century inadvertently revealed ancient river valleys buried beneath the seabed. Seismic scans designed to locate petroleum reserves mapped structures that looked nothing like marine formations. They were terrestrial, winding rivers, meandering channels, floodplains, and hills. Scientists realized they were looking at a landscape frozen in time, a drowned memory preserved beneath sediment. Doggerland was no longer speculation, but science. Paleoenvironmental studies added detail. Cores drilled from the seabed brought up layers of peat, pollen, and plant remains. Microscopic analysis revealed forests of birch, pine, and hazel, meadows filled with grasses, wetlands rich with reeds. Doggerland's ecology came alive again in laboratory slides. Radiocarbon dating established timelines, confirming that the land had flourished during the Mesolithic before succumbing to rising seas around 6000 BCE. Today, reconstructions of Doggerland are detailed and evocative. Computer models, built from seismic data and ecological studies, show a vast plain stretching from Britain to Denmark, cut by rivers flowing into great estuaries. Lakes dotted its interior, marshes spread across its lowlands, and uplands rose as islands amid encroaching seas. It was not marginal, but central, a fertile heartland supporting thousands. To walk Doggerland was to walk in a landscape as real as any in Europe until it drowned. The rediscovery of Doggerland captivated the public imagination. Newspapers dubbed it Britain's Atlantis, though unlike Atlantis, it was no myth. Its bones, tools, and sediments were tangible, undeniable. For archaeologists, Doggerland became a revelation, proof that prehistory was richer and more complex than once believed. For the public, it became a story of loss and mystery, a reminder that beneath the familiar sea lay forgotten worlds. Yet Doggerland's echoes are not merely romantic. They are scientific treasures, offering insights into climate change, human adaptation, and ecological transformation. In its drowned soils, researchers find evidence of how people responded to rising seas, how they shifted diets, tools, and settlements. In its sediments lie records of past climates, lessons for a present once again threatened by warming and inundation. Doggerland is not only prehistory, it is prophecy, a mirror of our own age of rising waters. Still, mystery remains. We know Doggerland's people hunted, fished, and gathered, but how did they experience its loss? Did they tell stories of drowned lands, of spirits angry in the waves? Did they resist the encroaching sea, or did they embrace new lives as seafarers? Archaeology recovers tools and bones, but not words, leaving us to imagine their grief, their resilience, their wonder at a world vanishing beneath the horizon. The sea itself continues to whisper. Each year, fishermen dredge new relics, mammoth tusks, aurochs skulls, flint axes shaped by human hands. Each artifact is an echo, a reminder that the sea floor is not empty but a vast, submerged archive. And each echo deepens our understanding of Doggerland, not as myth but as memory, not as Atlantis but as history. Thus, Chapter 7 traces the rediscovery of Doggerland, the echoes that rose from fishermen's nets, from seismic surveys, from cores of peat and pollen. It reveals how a forgotten land re-emerged in modern science, transforming from legend to fact. Doggerland may lie beneath waves, but its voice endures, speaking through artifacts, sediments, and stories. And in its rediscovery, we are reminded that the past is never truly gone. It waits beneath the surface, patient as the sea itself. Long before sonar revealed riverbeds beneath the North Sea, long before trawlers pulled human-crafted harpoons from the depths, stories of drowned lands already haunted Europe's imagination. From Wales to Brittany, from Ireland to the Low Countries, folklore spoke of fertile kingdoms lost beneath the waves, of cities swallowed whole, of bells still tolling beneath the sea. Whether these tales are direct memories of Doggerland's drowning or independent creations cannot be proven. Yet the resonance is undeniable. When the waters rose and Doggerland vanished, the trauma of loss may have left echoes that reverberated for millennia, transformed into myth and legend. One of the most enduring traditions comes from Wales, the legend of Cantor-ar-Gwyllt. Said to be a rich lowland kingdom lying beneath Cardigan Bay, it was protected by dikes and sluices. In the story, negligence or sin led to its flooding, and the land was lost forever. Fishermen claim that in storms they can still hear the bells of its churches ringing beneath the waves. Though written records of the legend are medieval, its motifs, fertile land drowned by sea, memory preserved in sound, mirrored Doggerland's fate. Could Cantor-ar-Gwyllt be a distant folk memory of ancient inundations along Britain's coasts, including Doggerland's final drowning? It cannot be proven, but the parallels are haunting. Across the sea in Brittany, the legend of YS tells of a splendid city built below sea level, protected by gates. Its princess, in some versions, betrays it, allowing the sea to flood its streets. YS is said to lie beneath the Bay of Douarnenez, its spires visible in clear water, its bells tolling like those of Cantor-ar-Gwyllt. Again, the motif is the same. Human pride or sin punished by waves, a fertile city reclaimed by the sea. Though undoubtedly shaped by Christian moralizing, the deeper layer may be ancestral memory of lands drowned in prehistory. Cornwall, too, carries the tale of Lyonesse, a land said to stretch between Land's End and the Isles of Scilly. According to legend, it was swallowed by the sea in a single night, leaving only scattered islands as remnants. Here again we find echoes of Doggerland's shrinking uplands, higher ground surviving as islets while the plains drowned. To those who watched their valleys vanish generation after generation, the memory of lands beneath the sea would have been as real as any myth. In Ireland, folklore tells of lost lands like High Brazil, a phantom island said to appear once every 7 years, and the plain of Moytura submerged beneath lakes. Stories of sudden floods, of kingdoms swallowed, recur across Celtic tradition. While not all are connected to Doggerland, the cultural preoccupation with drowned lands suggests a deep memory of loss that may stretch back to Mesolithic experiences. The Low Countries, where the sea has long threatened fertile polders, also preserve tales of drowned towns. In Zealand, people tell of Reamerswil, a city consumed by floods, its bells ringing beneath the waves. In Holland, legends abound of villages lost in the Zuiderzee, reclaimed only when dikes were built. These stories, though medieval, resonate with a cultural memory of encroaching seas, echoing the fate of Doggerland's people who lived and died as their land shrank. Scandinavian lore, too, hints at such memories. Norse sagas speak of Aegir, the sea god who hosts banquets beneath the waves, and of lands swallowed when waters rise. The Storegga tsunami, which devastated Norway and Scotland 8,200 years ago, may have imprinted itself into ancestral memory, preserved in tales of sudden flood. The people of Doggerland, caught in that same catastrophe, may have seeded oral traditions that spread across northern Europe. The universality of these myths is striking. Almost every European coast carries a tale of drowned lands, from Canterbury, Gwynedd to Ys, from Lyonesse to Zealand. Though shaped by later cultures and religions, the core theme endures. Fertile lands once stood where the sea now lies, and their loss was both mysterious and tragic. These are not merely coincidences, but cultural archetypes born of real experiences. As the seas rose after the Ice Age, entire landscapes disappeared, communities uprooted. Memories, transmitted orally across generations, solidified into story. By the time they were written down centuries later, the details were mythologized, but the essence, lost to the sea, remained. Doggerland, in this sense, is Europe's Atlantis. Unlike Plato's tale, it is not a philosophical allegory but a real land, lost not to divine wrath, but to geology. Yet the resemblance to Atlantis is uncanny. Both were fertile lands, drowned suddenly or gradually, remembered in myth as places swallowed by the ocean. It is perhaps no accident that when Doggerland was rediscovered by modern science, the press dubbed it Atlantis of the North Sea. The name resonates because the archetype is ancient, a land lost, a people dispersed, a memory drowned yet never fully silenced. But there is a difference. Atlantis, if it ever existed, is a mystery without physical proof. Doggerland is not. Its rivers are mapped, its soils drilled, its tools and bones recovered from nets. It is a real Atlantis, tangible and verifiable. The myths of drowned kingdoms across Europe may be the cultural memory of Doggerland's end, refracted and reimagined through centuries. If so, then Doggerland lives on not only in sediments, but in stories. The symbolic power of such myths lies in their universality. They warn of hubris, of pride punished by sea, but also of fragility, that no land is eternal, no kingdom immune to the tide. They speak to the primal fear of humans before the ocean, its vastness and power. For the Mesolithic peoples of Doggerland, this fear was lived reality. For their descendants, it became story, and for us, it is history rediscovered. Thus, Chapter 8 explores Doggerland as Europe's Atlantis, not a legend but a land whose loss echoes in myths of drowned kingdoms. It shows how memory survives catastrophe, how oral tradition preserves trauma, and how cultures across Europe remember the sea's power. Doggerland is not only a geological fact, but a cultural inheritance, haunting stories from Wales to Brittany, from Cornwall to Holland. In those myths, we glimpse not only imagination but remembrance, the voices of ancestors whispering from beneath the waves. The final chapter in Doggerland's story was not only the drowning of a landscape, but the creation of a boundary that would shape the course of European history. For millennia, Britain had been a peninsula of the continent, connected by forests and rivers to the great plain of Doggerland. Hunters walked freely from what is now France into what is now England, following herds, trading flint, and mingling with neighbors across the open land. But by 6000 BCE, As the seas finally closed over Doggerland, the connection was severed. Britain became an island, and that transformation changed everything. At first, the separation may not have been absolute. Doggerland did not vanish in a single night. Instead, it retreated step by step, marshes swelling into lagoons, uplands breaking into islands, coastlines eroding with each tide. For centuries, Mesolithic communities probably continued to move back and forth, using boats to cross narrowing channels. Yet gradually, the saltwater gulf widened until crossing became not a daily necessity but a deliberate journey. The psychological geography shifted. Britain was no longer a seamless part of Europe but a place apart. This change had profound consequences for the people who remained. Mesolithic Britons adapted to their insularity. The sea, once enemy, became protector, isolating them from continental upheavals and forcing them to rely more heavily on marine resources. Archaeological evidence from coastal sites shows intensified fishing and shellfish gathering, the sea becoming central to subsistence. Dugout canoes, once tools of river travel, became vital for connecting scattered coastal communities. In becoming an island, Britain became maritime. Isolation shaped identity. Communities that had once been linked by overland routes now developed distinctive traditions. Tools, ornaments, and ritual practices in Britain began to diverge subtly from those of the continent. Genetic studies suggest some continuity, but also signs of reduced gene flow after separation. Britain's people were not cut off entirely. They traded and traveled by sea, but their cultural trajectory began to curve apart. The first hints of an island identity, one that would echo through later millennia, emerged in these Mesolithic generations. The loss of Doggerland also altered the environment itself. Rising seas turned river valleys into estuaries. The Thames, the Humber, the Severn, and reshaped coastlines dramatically. Low-lying plains became tidal flats, salt marshes, and drowned forests. Even today, at low tide along the British coast, one can see the remains of submerged forests, tree stumps blackened with age, relics of once dry woodlands swallowed by the sea. These haunting landscapes are the direct descendants of Doggerland's drowning, reminders that the island of Britain was born in loss. For those who lived through the transformation, the change must have been bewildering. Stories of shrinking land, of drowned ancestors, of forests turned to salt water, surely circulated among coastal groups. Perhaps they told tales of punishment or of spirits reclaiming what was theirs. Such stories may have seeded the later myths of drowned lands in Celtic and Norse tradition. The very act of becoming an island was not merely geographical but mythic, shaping the imagination of those who saw their world change so profoundly. The separation also affected movement and exchange. Before Doggerland's drowning, groups could migrate freely across Europe's northern plains. With Britain isolated, migration slowed, though not entirely. Archaeological finds show continued contact with the continent, flint, shells, and ideas crossing by boat. Yet the effort required grew greater and the traffic lighter. Britain became a cul-de-sac of sorts, its people more self-reliant, its cultural evolution more insular. This isolation would later influence the spread of farming during the Neolithic, which reached Britain later than the continent. Doggerland's loss thus shaped not only geography, but history. Britain's transformation into an island also reshaped its ecosystems. As seas flooded Doggerland, marine species expanded. Fish populations grew in estuaries, seabirds colonized new cliffs, and seals basked on sandbanks. Humans adapted accordingly, becoming skilled coastal foragers and fishers. Sites like Starcar in North Yorkshire show evidence of people thriving in wetland environments, their lives attuned to a landscape shaped by water. The legacy of Doggerland's loss was not only cultural isolation but ecological adaptation, as Britain's people learned to live with the sea in ways their ancestors had not. In symbolic terms, the drowning of Doggerland was Britain's birth, the island identity that would echo through history. From Iron Age tribes who resisted Rome to the medieval sense of this sceptered isle was forged in Mesolithic waters. The sea, once a frontier, became moat and highway, shaping a culture oriented outward and inward at once. To become an island was to gain both protection and separation, opportunity and limitation. Doggerland's loss thus marked the beginning of Britain's distinctive path in Europe. Modern archaeology underscores this transformation. Mapping of the seabed reveals ancient river channels that once connected to the Thames and Rhine, now cut off by saltwater. Sediment cores show the progressive shift from freshwater marsh to marine sand, the physical record of isolation. The tools and bones dredged from the North Sea are not merely artifacts. They are the debris of a bridge between worlds, a bridge now lost. For us, the drowning of Doggerland carries lessons beyond prehistory. It reminds us that geography is not fixed but fluid, that islands and continents are not eternal but products of change. Britain's insularity, so often assumed a given, is a recent condition in geological terms, only 8,000 years old. Before that, Britain was Europe. The story of Doggerland is the story of how that unity was severed, how seas reshaped not only landscapes, but destinies. Thus, Chapter 10 traces how Doggerland's final drowning severed Britain from the continent, reshaping identity, culture, and ecology. It shows that the birth of an island was also the death of a land, that Britain's insularity was forged in loss. Doggerland's disappearance was not merely a geological event. It was a turning point in human history, setting Britain on a separate course that would echo across millennia. For centuries, the North Sea concealed Doggerland beneath its cold, gray waters, hiding its valleys, forests, and people in silence. Yet the sea is never still. Its restless tides and currents gnaw at the seabed, loosening what has lain buried for millennia. And so, beginning in the age of sail and intensifying with the trawlers of the industrial era, bones and tools began to surface, mute testimonies to a vanished world. In these fragments, dredged from the deep, Doggerland slowly spoke again. The earliest discoveries were regarded as curiosities. Fishermen hauling their nets across the Dogger Bank sometimes found enormous bones tangled in the mesh, femurs taller than a man, tusks curved like scythes, skulls with cavernous sockets. These were not the remains of whales, as some believed, but relics of the Ice Age: mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, aurochs, and elk. To sailors, they were objects of wonder, proof that giants had once walked the earth. Sold to collectors, displayed in curiosity cabinets, they hinted at a world both ancient and alien. Few suspected that these bones were not isolated freaks of geology, but the remnants of a drowned landscape once teeming with life. As natural history advanced in the 19th century, scholars began to recognize their significance. The bones of extinct animals, dredged consistently from the same regions of the seabed, pointed to a former landmass now submerged. Yet the revelation that humans had lived there too came later. In 1913, a fishing vessel working the Dogger Bank pulled up a barbed antler harpoon, its craftsmanship unmistakably human. The tool belonged to the Mesolithic, crafted thousands of years before Britain became an island. Its presence beneath the sea was proof beyond doubt. The North Sea had once been land, and people had thrived upon it. That harpoon was only the beginning. In 1931, a trawler dredging the Brown Bank, another submerged ridge, brought up a fragment of human skull. It was stained brown by centuries beneath the seabed, its contours unmistakably those of a modern human. Later analysis suggested it was between 8,000 and 10,000 years old, belonging to one of Doggerland's last inhabitants. To hold that fragment was to touch not only a person but a lost world, the face of someone who had lived, hunted, and loved on land now drowned. Over the decades, more artifacts emerged: flint blades sharpened by skilled hands, axes shaped for felling trees, bone awls for piercing hides, decorative pendants crafted from animal teeth. Each object told of a culture both practical and symbolic. Microliths, tiny flint blades used as arrowheads, spoke of hunters stalking deer across forests. Harpoons revealed fishing communities exploiting rivers and estuaries. Ornaments hinted at spiritual life, perhaps amulets or markers of identity. These were not faceless foragers, but people with traditions, technologies, and beliefs. Animal remains further fleshed out Doggerland's ecosystem. Red deer antlers, auroch skulls, bones of wild boar, elk, and even bear painted a picture of rich forests. Fish bones, including cod and herring, testified to abundant seas. Shell middens, Piles of discarded shells, dredged from submerged deposits, revealed reliance on mussels, oysters, and cockles. Together, these finds illuminated a world where land and water merged, where humans drew sustenance from both forest and tide. Modern techniques have sharpened this portrait. Sediment cores extracted from the seabed preserve pollen grains, plant fragments, and insect remains. Under microscopes, entire landscapes re-emerge. Hazel groves, birch woods, reed beds, meadows. DNA analysis of bones reveals genetic ties between Doggerland's people and Mesolithic communities across Europe. Stable isotope studies show their diets included fish, game, and gathered plants in balanced measure. From fragments, whole lives are inferred, piece by piece, bone by bone. Each discovery carries poignancy. The harpoon dredged in 1913 is more than a tool. It is the extension of a hand long vanished. The skull fragment from 1931 is not just bone. It is the echo of a life cut off by rising seas. To hold these objects is to stand in the presence of absence, to feel the weight of time compressed into fragile relics. They remind us that Doggerland is not myth, but memory, its people as real as ourselves. The North Sea continues to yield such treasures. Each year, fishermen bring up new finds: mammoth teeth, flint axes, red deer antlers with cut marks. Archaeologists now collaborate with trawler crews, collecting artifacts systematically. The seabed has become an underwater museum, its exhibits scattered by currents, awaiting recovery. Projects like the North Sea Paleolandscapes Initiative use sonar and sediment analysis to map ancient features, guiding research and dredging. In this way, Doggerland is being rediscovered not only through chance, but through deliberate science. Yet the bones from the deep are also fragile reminders of impermanence. Many are damaged by trawling, their context lost. Without excavation, their precise locations and layers vanish, limiting what can be learned. Doggerland is slipping away a second time, not beneath water, but beneath the demands of fishing, drilling, and industry. The task of archaeologists is urgent, to recover what can be saved before it is lost again. Still, what has been found is enough to reshape our understanding of Europe's past. Doggerland was not barren sea, but fertile plain, home to thousands of people. It was Europe's heartland during the Mesolithic, a place of abundance and innovation. Its drowning was not only a geological event, but a cultural tragedy, erasing a landscape and dispersing its people. In the bones from the deep, we glimpse both the life and the loss, the vitality of a land and the silence that followed. The symbolism of these discoveries is powerful. Each bone, each tool, is an echo across time, whispering of resilience and fragility. They remind us that beneath familiar seas lie forgotten worlds, that what we take for permanence is but a pause in the Earth's restless change. Doggerland's bones are not relics of a myth, but testimonies of a truth, that human history is entwined with landscapes that can vanish, and that our roots extend into lands we can no longer see. Thus, Chapter 9 uncovers Doggerland through its bones, human, animal, and cultural, dredged from the sea that buried it. In these fragments, the lost land speaks again, telling us of hunters and gatherers, of forests and rivers, of a people who thrived until the sea reclaimed their home. Doggerland is not silent. It whispers from the deep, reminding us of the impermanence of all things. The story of Doggerland is inseparable from the story of climate. Its rise and fall were not the results of conquest or collapse, but of shifting temperatures, melting ice, and rising seas. To understand Doggerland is to confront the deep truth that climate has always shaped human destiny, often in ways more profound than politics or war. For the Mesolithic people who called Doggerland home, climate was not an abstraction. It was the force that determined where they could live, what they could eat, and whether their world would endure. When the last ice age reached its peak around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today. Vast glaciers locked water into ice, stretching across Scandinavia, Scotland, and northern Europe. What we call the North Sea was then a dry, windswept plain. As the world warmed beginning around 12,000 years ago, the glaciers melted, rivers swelled, and seas rose. For the people who lived in Doggerland, this warming meant abundance. Forests replaced tundra, Animals multiplied, fish filled rivers, and plants flourished. It was, in many ways, a golden age. Yet the same warming that made Doggerland fertile also sowed the seeds of its destruction. The process was slow in human terms, but unstoppable in geological ones. Global seas rose at rates of about 1 meter per century, a pace imperceptible year to year, but devastating over generations. Campsites that once stood on dry ground became waterlogged, forests drowned, marshes spread. Communities adapted, moving inland, building boats, fishing more heavily. To a family, the change may have seemed manageable. To a culture spanning centuries, it was catastrophic. Archaeological and geological evidence reveals the stages of this transformation. Cores extracted from the seabed show peat layers overlain by marine sand, markers of freshwater marsh turning into tidal flat. Pollen grains shift from forest species to salt-tolerant plants. Animal bones record changes in hunting patterns, from land mammals to marine species. These layers are a diary of climate change written in mud and bone, showing step by step how Doggerland drowned. The 8.2-kilo-year event added a cruel twist. Triggered by massive glacial meltwater floods into the North Atlantic, this sudden cooling disrupted weather patterns, bringing harsher winters and shorter summers. For Doggerland survivors, the event compounded their challenges. Not only were seas rising, but the climate turned colder, reducing the abundance that had sustained them. This double blow, cooling above and flooding below, may have accelerated migration into Britain and continental Europe. Climate change was not just background, it was protagonist. Yet what did the people think? Without written records, we cannot know their interpretations, but human imagination always seeks explanation. Perhaps they saw the sea as a living force, a spirit expanding its realm. Perhaps they believed ancestors demanded new offerings, or that gods had turned their gaze away. Myths of drowned lands and later Europe may echo such interpretations. Canterar Gwaelid in Wales, Ys in Brittany, Lyonesse in Cornwall. Each tells of a land lost to the sea, often as punishment or neglect. These stories may preserve in mythic form the trauma of Doggerland's loss. Memory, even if reshaped, lingers. Oral traditions can survive for centuries, sometimes millennia, passing through generations as warning and lament. The people who fled Doggerland may have told their descendants of forests swallowed by salt water, of camps drowned, of ancestors lost. In those stories, geography became morality. Lands are fragile, the sea hungers, neglect or hubris brings ruin. When we hear echoes of such tales centuries later, we may be hearing Doggerland's memory, refracted but not extinguished. Modern science adds a new dimension to this memory. Doggerland has become a case study in past climate change, its sediments preserving how ecosystems and cultures responded to rising seas. It shows how human communities adapt, shifting diets, building boats, migrating. But it also shows limits. No matter how resourceful, they could not stop the ocean. Their story is a reminder that resilience has boundaries, and that adaptation comes with loss. The resonance with our own era is striking. Today, sea levels rise again, this time not from the slow retreat of ice sheets alone, but from human-driven warming. Cities from Miami to Jakarta face inundation. Islands in the Pacific shrink year by year. Coastal peoples are displaced, their homes swallowed just as Doggerland's were. The difference is speed. Modern seas rise faster, and human populations are vastly larger. Doggerland warns us what happens when the sea claims land. It does not return it. Doggerland also challenges our sense of permanence. We think of Britain as an island, of the North Sea as eternal. Yet these are recent configurations. 8,000 years ago, Britain was Europe. 8,000 years from now, the maps we know may again be unrecognizable. Doggerland's story reminds us that geography is fluid, and that human history is written on a canvas the Earth is always erasing. For archaeologists, Doggerland is both treasure and tragedy. Its sediments preserve extraordinary information, but recovery is difficult. Trawlers bring up bones and tools stripped of context, fragile echoes of a larger picture. Scientific surveys reveal river valleys and forests, but cannot yet excavate them fully. Doggerland remains partly hidden, half remembered. Its memory is fragmented, like the culture it represents. broken but not gone. And yet, the very act of rediscovery is powerful. By piecing together its story, we honor its people and learn from their resilience. We recognize that they were not faceless hunters but humans like us, with families, beliefs, and fears. They endured climate change not of their making, and though they lost their land, they adapted and carried on. Their memory survives in bones, tools, and stories, but also in us, for we are their descendants, inheritors of their resilience and their fragility alike. Thus, Chapter 11 places Doggerland in the context of climate, change, and memory. It shows how a fertile land became a drowned plain, how people adapted and mourned, and how memory endured in story and science. It reminds us that climate has always been destiny, and that the sea's patience outlasts our illusions of permanence. Doggerland's loss is not just prehistory. It is warning, mirror, and memory, whispering from beneath the waves that what was lost once can be lost again. The rediscovery of Doggerland is not a tale of myth or chance alone, but of science applied with precision and imagination. What the sea concealed for millennia, modern technology has begun to reveal. Through sonar beams, seismic surveys, sediment cores, and genetic analysis, researchers have pulled back the watery curtain to reconstruct a landscape once teeming with life. Doggerland has become not only a subject of archaeology, but of cutting-edge science, a laboratory of prehistory preserved beneath the waves. The first step in this scientific resurrection came with seismic imaging. Oil and gas exploration in the North Sea during the mid-20th century relied on seismic surveys. Bursts of sound sent into the seabed, their echoes mapped to reveal subsurface structures. Designed to locate petroleum deposits, these surveys inadvertently uncovered ancient river valleys, lakebeds, and uplands buried beneath marine sediments. Researchers examining the data recognized that these features were terrestrial, not marine. They were the ghostly veins of a drowned landscape, preserved like a fingerprint beneath the sea. Doggerland's map began to re-emerge. Sonar mapping refined the picture. Multi-beam sonar, sweeping the seabed with acoustic signals, revealed ridges, channels, and depressions invisible to the naked eye. The Dogger Bank appeared not just as a shoal, but as the remnant of an upland plain. Channels radiating outward showed where rivers once flowed, connecting to the ancient Thames and Rhine systems. Digital models reconstructed valleys and estuaries, revealing a landscape complex and fertile, a heartland rather than a wasteland. Sediment cores provided the texture of that world. Drilled from the seabed, these slender cylinders of mud and sand contained time capsules of ecology. Pollen grains, preserved for millennia, revealed forests of birch, pine, oak, and hazel. Peat layers testified to wetlands rich with reeds. Diatoms, microscopic algae, showed the transition from freshwater to brackish to marine environments, recording the sea's advance in microscopic detail. Each core was a diary, page by page documenting Doggerland's life and loss. Bones and artifacts dredged by trawlers added human and animal presence to this scientific portrait. Mammoth tusks, red deer antlers, aurochs skulls, and human tools were cataloged and radiocarbon dated, anchoring the landscape in time. Cut marks on bones testified to hunting and butchery. Harpoons and microliths revealed the technology of Mesolithic hunters. These finds transformed Doggerland from a geological curiosity into a human homeland, one that had supported thriving communities until the sea reclaimed it. In recent decades, ancient DNA has added a new dimension. Genetic material extracted from bones dredged from the seabed reveals ties between Doggerland's people and Mesolithic populations across Europe. Stable isotope analysis shows their diets, rich in fish, supplemented by game and gathered plants, reflecting adaptation to a changing environment. Through DNA, we glimpse their biological legacy, linking the drowned land's inhabitants to modern Europeans. Computer modeling brings these fragments together. By combining seismic data, ecological evidence, and archaeological finds, researchers create three-dimensional reconstructions of Doggerland. Digital maps show rivers winding through forests, lakes sparkling in uplands, marshes teeming with birds. They imagine settlements along riverbanks, canoes gliding across lagoons, hunters stalking deer through oak groves. These models are not fantasy, but evidence-based reconstructions, grounded in science, yet vivid enough to bring Doggerland alive. The scientific investigation of Doggerland has also revealed its vulnerability. Rising seas are not unique to our age. The sediments show how quickly landscapes can be erased. The Storega tsunami, recorded in sand layers across the North Atlantic, demonstrates the power of sudden catastrophe. For climate scientists, Doggerland offers a case study in resilience and loss, a prehistoric precedent for our own age of sea level rise. In this way, the drowned land is not only past, but prophecy, warning of what happens when seas reclaim coastlines. Yet the work is not easy. The North Sea is harsh, its currents destructive, its industrial uses intrusive. Fishing trawlers damage sites, scattering artifacts. Oil and gas drilling complicate excavation. Archaeologists must work with what chance and industry provide, piecing together a jigsaw with many missing pieces. The urgency is clear. Doggerland's archive is fragile, threatened by human activity as much as by natural erosion. Saving its memory requires cooperation across disciplines: archaeology, geology, climatology, genetics. The image of Doggerland emerging through science carries symbolic weight. For millennia, it was forgotten, its people erased. Yet through technology, we recover their world, giving voice to those who left no writing, no cities, only bones and tools. Science becomes a form of remembrance, a bridge across 10,000 years. In sonar echoes and DNA strands, in pollen grains and flint blades, Doggerland lives again. Its study also reshapes how we understand Europe's past. Far from marginal, Doggerland was central, a hub connecting Britain to the continent. Its loss shaped Britain's identity as an island, altering the trajectory of history. Without Doggerland, Britain would not be Britain. The science that reconstructs it is not only recovering a landscape, but rewriting the story of Europe itself. And yet, there is humility in this endeavor. Science can map rivers, identify pollen, sequence DNA, but it cannot recover laughter around a fire, stories told beneath the stars, fears whispered as waters rose. Those belong to imagination, to empathy, to the recognition that the people of Doggerland were human as we are. Science shows us their world. Storytelling reminds us it was lived. Together, they make Doggerland real again. Thus, Chapter 12 shows how modern science resurrects Doggerland from the deep. Through sonar and seismic surveys, sediment cores and DNA, computer models and artifacts, the drowned land emerges. It is not myth, but memory, not Atlantis, but archaeology. And in its scientific resurrection, we find both knowledge and warning, that landscapes can vanish, that seas can rise, that humanity endures but never untouched. Doggerland's story, written in mud and bone, is read anew in laboratories and charts. Its echoes clearer now than at any time since it drowned. Doggerland is not merely a chapter of prehistory, confined to the distant Mesolithic past. Its story, pieced together from sonar scans, pollen grains, and bones dredged from the North Sea, speaks to questions that remain urgent today. It is a parable of resilience and fragility, of how people adapt to change, yet cannot halt the great forces of nature. Its lessons reverberate across time, reminding us that our own civilizations, no matter how advanced, are not exempt from the rhythms of earth and sea. The first lesson is that landscapes are temporary. For generations, Doggerland's inhabitants would have seen their homeland as eternal. Its rivers carved valleys that seemed immovable, its forests stretched to horizons, its plains provided food in abundance. Yet within a few centuries, all of it was gone. Rising seas erased not only land but memory, leaving behind only scattered shoals and sandbanks. To us, the loss seems sudden in geological terms, but for the people who lived there it was slow enough to breed false security. Each generation may have believed the encroaching marshes were manageable, that higher ground would suffice. In this complacency lies a warning for us, who today witness rising seas but struggle to act against their inevitability. The second lesson is human resilience. Despite the loss, Doggerland's people did not perish entirely. They adapted, shifting diets from deer to fish, moving settlements inland, fashioning canoes to navigate new waterways. They carried their skills into Britain and continental Europe, blending with other groups, seeding new traditions. Their world was erased, but their culture endured. This resilience is inspiring, showing humanity's ability to survive in the face of overwhelming change. Yet resilience has limits. Doggerland's people could adapt, but they could not save their land. They remind us that adaptation cannot always preserve what is lost. Sometimes it only softens the blow. The third lesson is memory itself. Though Doggerland disappeared, echoes of its drowning may linger in folklore. The tales of Cantorar Gwaelid, YS, and Lioness, kingdoms swallowed by the sea, speak to a cultural memory of lands lost. Even if not directly descended from Doggerland's people, these stories reveal how deeply humans fear and remember inundation. Myth becomes a vessel for memory, carrying trauma across millennia. Today, too, we tell stories of rising seas, of Miami and Jakarta, of Pacific islands vanishing, of Venice sinking beneath floods. These are modern myths in the making, cultural responses to loss that mirror those of Mesolithic ancestors. Doggerland also teaches us about interconnectedness. Its rivers linked the Thames to the Rhine. Its plains served as crossroads where peoples mingled. When the land drowned, these networks were disrupted, reshaping migration, trade, and identity. Britain became an island not by choice, but by geological force, its trajectory forever altered. The lesson is that geography is not static but dynamic, and human cultures are shaped by its shifts. Today, globalization creates new networks of trade and identity, but these too depend on coastlines and climates. Rising seas could fracture them as surely as Doggerland's loss severed Britain from Europe. The scientific study of Doggerland offers another lesson, that the Earth remembers even when we forget. In sediments and cores, in bones and tools, the story lies waiting. This challenges us to think long-term, to see beyond our lifespans. Climate change, rising seas, ecosystem collapse. These are not abstract predictions, but processes already underway, just as in Doggerland. By reading the Earth's archives, we can anticipate futures that otherwise seem unimaginable. Doggerland's loss is not only history, it is model and metaphor, a rehearsal for what the Anthropocene may hold. The psychological lesson may be the hardest. For Doggerland's last inhabitants, the drowning of their homeland must have been a trauma beyond words. To watch familiar valleys vanish, to know ancestors lay beneath waves, to lose sacred groves and hunting grounds. It was a grief as profound as any war or famine. Yet this grief left no texts, only echoes. It reminds us that human suffering can be vast and yet vanish without record, leaving only silence. As seas rise again today, millions face displacement, and their grief too may echo in future myths. The parallel is stark, urging empathy across time. Doggerland also demonstrates the double-edged nature of abundance. It was fertile, rich, a land of rivers and forests. Its very prosperity drew people, sustained life, and nurtured culture. But its low-lying abundance also made it vulnerable. The same fertility that made Doggerland thrive ensured it would be lost first when seas rose. The lesson is clear. Prosperity often carries hidden fragility. Today's great coastal cities, from New York to Shanghai, mirror Doggerland's paradox. They flourish because of their location by the sea, and for that same reason they are threatened. Doggerland is their shadow, a reminder that prosperity does not guarantee permanence. Finally, Doggerland teaches humility. It shows that human beings, however inventive, are bound by natural forces larger than themselves. The Mesolithic people were skilled, adaptive, creative, but they could not command the sea. Neither can we. The difference is that our actions now hasten the forces we face. Where Doggerland's people were victims of natural warming, we are agents of our own rising seas. This inversion intensifies the lesson. We cannot plead ignorance, only responsibility. The lessons of Doggerland are therefore layered. The impermanence of landscapes, the resilience and limits of adaptation, the persistence of memory and myth, the fragility of prosperity, the humility demanded by nature's scale. These are not distant curiosities, but urgent truths. When we stand on Britain's cliffs and gaze across the North Sea, we are not merely looking at water. We are looking at a graveyard of forests and rivers, at the bones of mammoths and people, at a lost world whose story warns us of our own. Thus, Chapter 13 makes Doggerland more than prehistory. It becomes a teacher across millennia, offering hard-earned wisdom about climate, resilience, and fragility. It reminds us that all lands are temporary, that seas always wait, and that survival demands both adaptation and memory. Doggerland's people endured, but their world did not. The lesson is stark but necessary. Nothing is permanent, not even continents. Doggerland's disappearance was not merely the drowning of a landscape, but a reshaping of Europe itself. The continent we recognize today, with Britain as an island, the North Sea as a restless boundary, and the cultural differences between the peoples of the Isles and the mainland, was born in the slow death of this drowned plain. To understand the making of Europe is to recognize Doggerland's role as both bridge and barrier, connector and divider, heartland and grave. For thousands of years, Doggerland was a corridor. Its rivers braided together the Thames and the Rhine, the Seine and the Elbe, binding Europe into one vast system of movement and exchange. Hunters walked from what is now Denmark into what is now England without pause, carrying tools, stories, and genes. Ideas and innovations flowed freely across the land. The continent was not fractured but whole, its peoples tied together by geography as well as kinship. Doggerland was central to this unity. When the seas rose and Doggerland drowned, the corridor became a moat. Britain was cut off. The effects of this separation rippled through millennia. Culturally, insularity encouraged divergence. Mesolithic Britons, once part of the same networks as their continental cousins, began to develop traditions increasingly distinct. Though boats allowed continued contact, the flow of people and ideas slowed. Isolation fostered uniqueness. Stone tools in Britain took on slightly different forms, dietary patterns diverged, and communities adjusted to island life. Britain was not alone, but it was apart. Genetically, the separation mattered too. Studies of ancient DNA show that Mesolithic Europeans were genetically connected across wide distances, but Britain's isolation after 600 BCE reduced this flow. Later migrations, such as the arrival of Neolithic farmers around 4000 BCE, had to cross water deliberately, creating bottlenecks that shaped the genetic heritage of the islands. Doggerland's drowning thus influenced not only culture but biology, leaving traces still visible in modern populations. Geopolitically, the transformation was decisive. Britain's island status became one of its defining features, influencing its history from the Bronze Age to the modern era. The sea became both barrier and shield, protecting it from invasions even as it limited exchange. Rome struggled to hold the island. Medieval kingdoms defended it fiercely. Modern Britain invoked its insularity in forging an empire across the seas. All of this began when Doggerland sank. Without the sea's intervention, Britain might have remained a peninsula, its destiny entwined with Europe's heart rather than set apart from it. The drowning of Doggerland also created the North Sea itself, a maritime space that became central to Europe's history. What had been forests and valleys turned into trade routes and fishing grounds. The Dogger Bank, once an upland plain, became one of the richest fishing grounds in the world, sustaining economies from medieval times to the present. The sea that erased a land became a resource in its own right, shaping economies and cultures for centuries. The paradox is striking. Doggerland's death gave birth to new lifeways. Archaeology highlights this transformation. Coastal sites in Britain show increased reliance on marine resources after isolation. Shell middens, fish traps, and harpoons proliferate. Continental Europe, meanwhile, developed differently, with broader trade networks across land. The divergence of lifeways was subtle but steady, laying the foundations for Europe's regional identities. Britain turned increasingly toward the sea, while the continent looked inward across its plains. Doggerland's drowning was thus the hinge on which identities turned. The psychological impact also mattered. To be cut off by water is to feel different. The stories people told about their world changed as their geography changed. Oral traditions may have preserved memories of loss, forests swallowed, lands drowned, but also of uniqueness, of being set apart. Later British myths often emphasize insularity, the sense of being distinct from the continent. These feelings may trace their roots back to Mesolithic experiences of separation, when the sea was no longer frontier but defining boundary. In this way, Doggerland helped make Europe as we know it. The continent's map, its genetics, its cultures, its economies, all were shaped by the drowning of this land. The loss created not only absence but structure, carving boundaries that would shape destiny. Doggerland's death was Europe's birth. For historians, the implications are profound. It shows that geography is not static but formative, that the physical world shapes culture as much as politics or ideology. Doggerland's drowning was as consequential as any battle or empire, though it left no chronicles. Its influence is visible not in texts, but in coastlines, in genes, in myths. The making of Europe was not only human, it was geological. For us today, the lesson is sobering. The boundaries we take for granted, seas, coasts, islands, are recent and fragile. They can shift again. Rising seas threaten to redraw maps, just as they did in the Mesolithic. Cities may vanish, nations may lose land, and identities may shift in ways as profound as when Britain became an island. Doggerland is a reminder that Europe has been remade before and will be remade again. Thus, Chapter 14 situates Doggerland in the making of Europe. It was once a bridge, then a loss, then a boundary that shaped millennia. Its disappearance altered culture, genetics, politics, and identity. In the drowned plains beneath the North Sea lies the foundation of modern Europe, invisible yet decisive. Doggerland may be gone, but in its absence, Europe was born. Though Doggerland vanished beneath the sea more than 8,000 years ago, it has returned in another form, not as dry land, but as memory, science, and imagination. The drowned plain that once linked Britain to Europe is today a subject of fascination, a ghostly presence shaping how we think about the past and how we envision the future. In its absence, Doggerland has become more vivid than ever, reborn as Europe's Atlantis, as a field of scientific inquiry, and as a mirror for our own anxieties about climate and loss. The return of Doggerland began in fragments, mammoth bones dredged by trawlers, harpoons caught in nets, skulls pulled from the seabed. At first, they were curiosities, marvels shown in museums or tucked into private cabinets. Only gradually did their significance become clear, that they belonged to a land, a people, and a world long drowned. In the 20th and 21st centuries, with seismic mapping and sonar, Doggerland emerged more fully, its rivers and valleys traced beneath the waves. Scientists could now chart its contours, reconstruct its ecosystems, and place humans back into its story. A land once forgotten had become one of the most exciting frontiers of archaeology. Yet Doggerland's return is not limited to science. It has entered popular imagination, evoked in books, documentaries, and art. Writers describe it as a lost Eden, a fertile heartland swallowed by time. Filmmakers animate its forests and hunters, giving faces to its vanished people. Museums create exhibitions that let visitors walk through reconstructions of Mesolithic camps, hear the calls of red deer, feel the shadow of encroaching seas. For the public, Doggerland is not merely data but drama, the story of a world that lived and died, and that still whispers beneath the North Sea. Doggerland has also returned as metaphor. In an age of climate change, its drowning resonates with new urgency. What happened slowly in the Mesolithic, seas rising by a meter per century, now accelerates in decades. Cities face the fate of Doggerland's plains. Islands shrink, coastlines retreat. Doggerland becomes prophecy, a reminder that the sea always advances, that landscapes we take for permanent can vanish. It is not only prehistory, but warning, a mirror in which we see our own fragility reflected. For scientists, Doggerland's return offers a case study in resilience. Its people did not collapse when seas rose. They adapted, fished, built boats, and moved. Their story shows both the possibilities and the limits of human response. It cautions us that while adaptation is possible, it comes with loss of land, of memory, of identity. In this way, Doggerland teaches us humility, reminding us that survival may mean change, and that no society is exempt from the forces of nature. The return of Doggerland, is also political. Discussions about Britain's relationship with Europe often evoke the sea as divider, as destiny. Yet the rediscovery of Doggerland reminds us that Britain was once part of Europe not only culturally but physically, joined by a shared landscape and people. In this sense, Doggerland undermines modern myths of insularity, revealing a deeper history of connection. The sea that divides today once united, and the memory of Doggerland challenges us to think beyond boundaries. There is also an ethical dimension to Doggerland's return. The seabed is threatened by trawling, drilling, and industrial activity. Each pass of a net scatters artifacts. Each drill bit disrupts sediments that hold memory. Archaeologists call for protection, for recognition that the North Sea is not only water but archive, containing the remains of thousands of years of human life. To neglect Doggerland is to let it be lost a second time, not by sea but by indifference. In another sense, Doggerland has returned through myth. The stories of drowned kingdoms, Cantorar Gwaelid, Y.S., Lioness, have taken on new resonance in light of its rediscovery. People see in them not fantasy but memory, a cultural echo of real inundations. Doggerland becomes the bridge between archaeology and legend, between science and story. It is Europe's Atlantis, but unlike Atlantis, it is real. Its rivers can be mapped, its tools held, its bones studied. Its return unites fact and imagination, grounding myth in mud and bone. For the descendants of its people, modern Europeans, the return of Doggerland is also personal. Genetic studies show that the Mesolithic inhabitants of Doggerland were ancestors of populations across Britain and the continent. Their bloodlines survive in us. To speak of Doggerland is not to speak of strangers, but a family long forgotten. Its return is a homecoming, a reminder that beneath the waters lies part of our shared origin. Ultimately, Doggerland's return lies in its lessons. It shows us the impermanence of land, the resilience of people, the persistence of memory, and the power of story. It teaches that geography shapes destiny, that seas redraw maps, that human cultures endure but never unchanged. It returns not as land but as wisdom, a gift salvaged from loss. Thus, Chapter 15 closes the narrative of Doggerland by charting its return. Lost to the sea, it resurfaces in science, imagination, myth, and meaning. Its valleys and forests are gone, but its story is more alive than ever. Doggerland is not forgotten. It waits beneath the waves, whispering its lessons to those who listen. Its return is not the recovery of land, but of memory, and memory, unlike land, cannot drown. Beneath the restless waters of the North Sea lies a landscape once alive with rivers, forests, and families. Doggerland was no myth, but a homeland, a bridge that bound Britain to Europe, a place where people hunted, fished, gathered, and told stories around fires. For millennia it thrived, only to be undone by forces far beyond human control. Ice melted, seas rose, the earth shifted, and the plain that had seemed eternal was erased. Today, only sandbanks, bones, and fragments of memory remain. Doggerland's story is a reminder of impermanence. Landscapes that feel permanent are fragile. The maps we draw are temporary. For its people, valleys and meadows must have seemed as timeless as our own cities and coastlines do to us. Yet within centuries they were drowned, their permanence revealed as an illusion. The sea reminds us that all ground is borrowed, and that nature's patience is longer than our own. It is also a story of resilience. Doggerland's people did not vanish with their land. They adapted, shifting to boats and fish, migrating into Britain and Europe, carrying their knowledge into new lives. They survived even as their homeland did not. This resilience is inspiring, but it also carries a lesson. Survival comes with loss. Adaptation is possible, but it does not preserve everything. Cultures endure, but landscapes can die. Memory, too, is part of Doggerland's legacy. Though the land itself disappeared, its echoes linger in myth. From Cantorar Gwaelid in Wales to Y.S. in Brittany, from Lioness in Cornwall to the drowned towns of Holland, European folklore is filled with stories of fertile lands swallowed by waves. Whether directly descended from Doggerland or not, these myths reveal how deeply humans remember loss. They turn trauma into story, warning into legend. Doggerland survives not only in sediments and bones, but in the imagination of those who came after. For modern science, Doggerland is a treasure and teacher. Seismic scans trace its rivers, cores reveal its forests, DNA ties its people to us. It is Europe's Atlantis, but unlike Atlantis, it is real, mapped, dated, and tangible. Archaeology resurrects its memory, showing us how people lived, how they adapted, and how they were displaced. In doing so, Doggerland offers us a mirror. For as seas rise again today, threatening coasts and cities, we too face choices of adaptation and loss. What happened slowly then is happening swiftly now, and the lesson is clear: the sea always reclaims. Perhaps the most profound legacy of Doggerland is humility. It shows us that humanity, however ingenious, is not master of the earth but participant in its rhythms. The people of Doggerland were skilled and adaptive, but they could not hold back the ocean. Neither can we. We may build dikes, walls, and technology, but in the end, nature is greater. Doggerland's drowned valleys whisper across time that survival depends not on conquering nature, but on respecting its scale. In the end, Doggerland is not only past but present. It lies beneath the North Sea still, its rivers frozen in sediment, its forests preserved as peat, its tools and bones scattered on the seabed. It is gone, yet not gone. It teaches us that landscapes vanish but stories endure, that seas erase but memory restores, that loss can become